Imagine this. You've spent your life surrounded by family, building memories and cherishing every moment. But now, in your twilight years, you feel like a shadow of your former self, loved but forgotten. That's how Roberto felt. At 74, he'd given his all to his family, only to find himself sitting in the back seat of a car, clutching a suitcase, convinced he was being taken to a nursing home. The signs were all there. The hushed conversations, the distant smiles, the way his son Alejandro avoided his gaze when the topic came up. Roberto tried to make peace with it after all. He didn't want to be a burden. But as the car moved farther away from home, his heart ached with one thought. Is this how my story ends? But what if this journey wasn't about saying goodbye, but about starting something new? Roberto Morales, a 74-year-old widower, once led a life bursting with joy and purpose in a small rural town. Known for his warm laughter and boundless energy, he spent his days cultivating his family farm, hosting lively gatherings, and cherishing the love of his life, Sofia. Together, they built a cozy home filled with memories of their children's laughter, Sofia's cooking, and countless sunsets watched from their porch. But those vibrant days felt like a distant memory now. After Sofia passed away 5 years ago, Roberto's life changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. His health began to decline, his knees ached, his breathing grew labored, and he needed help with even the simplest tasks. With his independence slipping away, he moved in with his son, Alejandro, and daughter-in-law, Mariana, in the bustling city. At first, it seemed like a blessing. Alejandro provided for him, and Roberto loved being close to his grandson, Diego. But over time, the vibrant household grew quieter. Alejandro's busy work schedule and Mariana's constant errands left little time for Roberto. His guilt over taking Diego's old room festered, and every time he heard the boy complaining about sharing space with his sister, Roberto's heart sank a little more. He tried to ignore the creeping sense of isolation, but it became impossible to shake. Alejandro rarely spoke to him beyond polite exchanges, and Roberto began to convince himself that his son saw him as a burden. He felt like an outsider in a house that wasn't truly his. Each day, the weight of guilt and loneliness grew heavier, making Roberto question his place in the family he loved so dearly. Roberto had been wrestling with his emotions for weeks. Each passing day felt heavier, and every small moment added to his growing certainty he was a burden. One morning, as Alejandro hurried to leave for work, Roberto mustered his courage. His voice was soft but steady as he said, "Mijo, I think it's time for me to go to a nursing home." The words stung as they left his lips. He didn't want to leave, but the guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. In his mind, he replayed every moment he felt like an intruder. Diego grumbling about sharing his room, Mariana sighing heavily when Roberto asked for help with something small, and Alejandro's distant demeanor. This is the best thing for everyone, Roberto convinced himself. Alejandro barely paused. "Not now, Papa. Let's talk later," he said, distractedly grabbing his car keys and heading out the door. Roberto stood there feeling dismissed and deflated. He wondered if Alejandro had even heard him. Over the next few days, Roberto's resolve solidified. Alejandro's busyness, Mariana's preoccupied looks, and the silence at meals confirmed what Roberto feared. They didn't have the time or energy for him anymore. One evening, while everyone was asleep, he quietly began packing his belongings. He folded his clothes with trembling hands, placing his few cherished items, a photo of Sofia, his rosary, and a small notebook of family recipes, into his worn suitcase. As he zipped it shut, a heavy sadness settled over him. This was his goodbye, even if no one had said the words aloud. It was early on a crisp Saturday morning when Alejandro knocked on Roberto's door. "Papa, get ready, we're going on a trip," he said, smiling. Roberto hesitated, surprised by the request. He glanced at his already packed suitcase by the door. Alejandro's timing felt uncanny. Perhaps Alejandro had decided to take him to the nursing home after all. A mix of relief and heartbreak swirled in Roberto's chest. Roberto quietly got dressed, his hands trembling as he put on his favorite sweater Sofia had knitted it for him years ago. He clutched his suitcase tightly as Alejandro led him to the car. The drive began in silence. Roberto stared out the window, watching the city fade into the distance. Towering buildings gave way to rolling fields, and the sight brought an ache of nostalgia. The rural landscapes reminded him of his old life, the life he had shared with Sofia. His mind wandered, pulling him into a swirl of memories. He could almost feel Sofia's hand in his, hear her, laughter echoing in their kitchen. He pictured their family home, the warm, earthy tones of the walls, the garden where she planted sunflowers, and the cozy living room where they spent countless evenings. The car hit a bump, jolting Roberto back to the present. He glanced at Alejandro and noticed something unusual. Alejandro and Mariana exchanged quick glances, their expressions unreadable. Occasionally they whispered to each other, followed by faint smiles that deepened Roberto's confusion. Roberto's heart sank. Why were they smiling? Were they relieved to finally have this done? He clenched his suitcase tighter. As the journey continued, Roberto's unease grew. The nursing home must be far out of town, he thought. But why take him so far away? The mystery gnawed at him, filling the air with quiet tension as the car rolled on. The car slowed as it turned onto a dirt path, the hum of the engine breaking the serene silence. Roberto peered through the window, puzzled. Instead of a parking lot or the sterile surroundings he expected of a nursing home, they were entering a clearing surrounded by tall, swaying trees. The scene was unfamiliar, yet a deep sense of recognition tugged at him. As the car came to a stop, Roberto froze. In front of him stood a beautifully restored version of his old home. His heart skipped a beat. The house he had thought was lost forever after the fire, it was here, gleaming in the sunlight as if untouched by time. The warm yellow paint, the porch where he and Sofia used to sit in the evenings, the neatly tended garden, it was all there, just as he remembered it. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the vision of Alejandro stepping out of the car. Roberto's hands trembled as he gripped the door handle, unable to move. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. What is this? He finally managed to whisper. Alejandro walked over, opened the car door, and gently steadied his father. "Welcome home, Papa," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Roberto stood there, tears streaming down his weathered face. How is this possible?" he asked, his voice cracking. Alejandro smiled. "We've been working on this for months. Mariana and I, along with the neighbors, rebuilt it. We knew how much this place meant to you, Papa. We wanted to bring you back to where your heart has always been." As Roberto took a hesitant step forward, a loud, familiar whinny rang out. His old horse, Palomo, appeared from behind the house, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. Roberto gasped, overcome with emotion. "Palomo, you found him?" Alejandro nodded. "We couldn't do this without him. He's part of your life, your memories. Just like this house." Roberto fell to his knees, overwhelmed by gratitude and love. I thought you didn't want me," he sobbed. Alejandro knelt beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You're our family, Papa. You'll always have a place with us." Alejandro took Roberto by the hand, guiding him up the steps of the restored home. "Come inside, Papa. There's more." As Roberto entered, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers greeted him. The house was alive with memories. The living room was just as he remembered. The sturdy brown armchair, the bookshelf lined with his old novels, and the hand-woven rug Sofia had picked out decades ago. Roberto's eyes fell on the mantel above the fireplace, and there it was, a framed photo of Sofia, her kind smile forever etched in time. He reached out to touch it, his hand trembling. The dam of emotions broke and he wept openly. Alejandro and Mariana stood quietly, giving him a moment. When Roberto turned to them, his voice was filled with raw emotion. "You brought her back to me. You brought everything back." Mariana smiled warmly. "We couldn't let you feel like a stranger in your own life." As they moved through the house, Alejandro explained how they salvaged what they could from the old home and rebuilt the rest with help from the community. The dining table where family meals were shared, the lace curtains Sofia had sewn, Even Roberto's old toolbox, all were lovingly restored or replicated. In the backyard, Roberto found Palomo grazing near the sunflower garden, just as he and Sofia had dreamed. Alejandro placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Papa, I could never take you to a nursing home. You raised me with love, gave me a life I could be proud of. It's my turn to do the same for you." Roberto's heart swelled with a profound realization. He was not a burden. He was loved deeply and unconditionally. As the sun set over the familiar landscape, Roberto sat on the porch with Alejandro and Mariana, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. This wasn't just a return to his old home, it was the beginning of a new chapter filled with love and gratitude. The evening air was crisp and calm as Roberto sat on the porch, the wooden rocking chair creaking gently beneath him. Beside him, Alejandro leaned back, hands resting on his lap, watching the sun dip below the horizon. In the distance, Palomo grazed peacefully in the golden glow of the fading light. Roberto exhaled deeply, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "I spent so much time thinking I was a burden," he said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "I never imagined this. Everything you've done for me, Alejandro. I don't have the words." Alejandro smiled, his gaze steady on the horizon. "You don't need words, Papa. You taught me what love is. This was the least I could do." For the first time in a long while, Roberto allowed himself to feel not just accepted, but cherished. As the stars began to twinkle above, he found himself thinking about the days ahead, not with dread, but with hope. He and Palomo's imagined planting a vegetable garden in the backyard, like he and Sofia once dreamed of. He thought about brushing mane and sharing quiet mornings on this porch, listening to the birds. His mind shifted to family dinners, laughter filling the house, and perhaps teaching his grandson some of the old trades he had mastered in his youth. For the first time, the future felt like a gift. Roberto placed a hand on Alejandro's arm. "You've given me more than a home, son. You've reminded me that family isn't about what we owe, it's about what we share." Alejandro nodded. "And love, Papa, doesn't count burdens, it counts blessings." As the night enveloped them, Roberto felt a profound sense of peace. He wasn't leaving life behind, he was starting anew, surrounded by love. For anyone watching their story, one truth stood out. Family is never an obligation. It is the foundation on which life's greatest joys are built.